I could start sourdough over, I'd skip the confusion and do these 8 things from day one. I've baked over 10,000 loaves and I learned all of this the hard way, so you don't have to. Spend the next few minutes with me and I'll show you the simple things that actually make sourdough work for beginners. Let's go. The first thing I would do if I was starting over is understand how my starter should be taken care of. Because honestly, your bread is only going to be as good as your starter. It really is the most important part of the entire process. First, get an established starter if you can. That means if you have a friend, neighbor, relative that makes sourdough bread, ask them if you can have some of their starter. Trust me, we have tons of starter and we're almost always happy to give it away to our friends and family. Now, if you don't have somebody that bakes sourdough bread, you can go to a farmer's market and ask one of the bakers there if you can have some of their starter. And if you still can't find an established starter, you can always buy one. In fact, you can even buy mine like hundreds of other people. But having an established starter is going to save you a lot of heartache, because even though you've watched videos telling you it's easy to make a sourdough starter, it's really not that easy, and a lot of people really struggle with it. So try to find an established starter. The second thing is make sure you take really good care of your starter once you have it. That means giving it a good feeding of flour and water daily if you're leaving it out on the counter. If you're going to be storing your starter in the refrigerator, discard, give it your flour and water, put it in the refrigerator, and then before you want to bake with it, take it out, discard, give it flour and water at least twice before you bake with it. That'll give it time to kind of wake back up and get going. Now, the other thing I really did not understand when I was a new baker was when to use my sourdough starter. So I have my starter here in my handy little jar, and I did a little drawing for you. Now, I'm not a great artist, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to say here. Now, the blue line is where my starter was when I fed it today. Anywhere in the red zone is where I would not use my starter. Anywhere in the green zone is where I would use my starter. So what's happening here is that I fed my starter, it was at the blue line. Anywhere in the green zone means that my starter has doubled in size. It's risen, it's active, it's healthy. Now, a lot of times my starter will triple in size, so it might go all the way up to the top of the jar, and that's great. But anywhere in this green zone is going to be fine. That means the starter is rising, or it has already had a good rise and started to fall, but it hasn't fallen that much. Now, the red zone is where I wouldn't use my starter. And that's because the red zone is where the starter either hasn't risen enough, or it's risen and it's already fallen a little bit too much that I really wouldn't want to use it to make the best bread, okay? So red zone, no go, green zone, you're good to go. And the other thing I want to point out here are all of the bubbles that you see on this jar. So these are the bubbles in my starter letting me know that it's really healthy and really active, and this is ready to use. Now, if you look at this other starter here, I haven't fed this one in a day and a half, and you can see there's hardly any bubbles in this jar. It's really just a flat starter. What do you think would happen if I make bread with the flat starter versus the one that's active and healthy and has tons of bubbles? My bread is going to rise better with this starter, okay? And then last thing, let's look at the inside of these starters. If we can go top down, you'll see this one is light and airy. There's bubbles all over the surface of the jar. Ooh, it even bubbled right there. I don't know if you saw that. And then this one really has nothing going on. Now this is cool. I'm going to slam this jar down and we'll see if we can get it to make any more bubbles for you so you can see how active it is, okay? Do you see that? This starter is full of air. Now I'm going to stir it up a little bit. Whoa, it's bubbling there for you because there's a lot of activity going on in here. Okay, let me stick my spoon in here and show you what an active sourdough starter looks like. There you go. So this is what you want your sourdough starter to look like versus, let me show you this other one here. That really kind of just has nothing going on. And that is why we take really good care of our sourdough starter, and it will take good care of us, and we'll be making great bread. I would learn a lot more about how temperature affects dough if I was starting over. Temperature is a really important part of the sourdough process. Warmer dough ferments more quickly and cooler dough ferments more slowly. Now, if you want your sourdough process to be predictable and reliable, you need to be able to manage your dough temperature. That's how you stop guessing and stop having days where it takes 8 hours for your dough to bulk ferment, and the next time you bake, it takes 3 hours. That makes it really hard to understand the process and to predict when bulk ferment might be done. So I know that taking your dough's temperature with a thermometer can feel like overkill. And you're like, Heather, I just want to make sourdough bread. I don't want the process to be overly complicated. But stick with me here for a second, because understanding how temperature affects bulk fermentation and your dough is actually going to make the process easier for you and more reliable. So don't be like me and fight it, okay? Just lean into the temperature thing. So it's really not that difficult. If you are in somewhere where it's cold, you live somewhere where it's cold, it's like winter time like it is for me, and it's really cold, your dough is going to take a long time to bulk ferment. So what do? You're going to use warmer water when you mix up your dough. So normally I like to use water that's about 82 degrees Fahrenheit, but in the wintertime I'll use water that's 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and that'll just bump the temperature of my dough up a little bit. Now, if you live somewhere where it's really, really hot, you might want to make your dough with cold water so you can slow down the fermentation. The goal is to have a reliable fermentation process so you have an idea of when your dough should be ready. Now, bulk fermentation is what almost every new baker struggles with, so knowing the temperature of your dough can really, really help with this process. Now, when do you take your dough temperature? I take my dough temperature right after I mix my ingredients, just so I have an idea of what it's going to be, and it might be a little bit warmer at that point because you've been mixing your dough for a while. And then I take my dough temperature again after my last stretch and fold. That's it. At the beginning when you mix your ingredients, and at the end after your last stretch and fold. And that just gives me an idea. If I take this dough temperature and it tells me that it's 81 degrees, I know it's going to bulk ferment pretty quickly because my target dough temperature is 76 to 78 degrees. And I know that when my dough temperature is 76 to 78 degrees, it takes about 5 hours for my dough to bulk ferment. So if I take the temperature and it's 74 degrees, it's going to take a lot longer. Now, besides changing the temperature of your water, what can you do to warm up or cool down your dough? I use a really inexpensive seed heating mat, and it's just a great way to gently warm up your dough, especially in the winter. Now, if it's really, really hot where you live, you might want to put your dough in the refrigerator for just like a half an hour to cool it down. The other thing you can do if it's cold is put your dough in the oven with the oven light on. Now, pro tip here, and I'm telling you this from experience, make sure that if your dough is in the oven, that you put a note on the oven that says do not turn on, so somebody doesn't bake your dough on accident. And don't leave the oven light on for more than 20 or 30 minutes because it can actually get really, really warm in that oven and your dough will overheat, and you don't want that either. So temperature plays a really crucial role in the bulk fermentation sourdough process. High hydration is overrated. What does that mean? Hydration is just the amount of water that's in your recipe. Now, if you've looked at social media at all, you have seen these photos of beautiful loaves of sourdough bread with these huge holes going throughout the bread. That's called the crumb, and that's a wild or open crumb where there's big holes all throughout the bread. And while I agree that that does look beautiful, it's not the best experience to eat a slice of bread with all those giant holes in it, right? You put your butter on it and it just like falls right out of the bread. I mean, come on, you're just wasting butter at that point and it's not gonna taste as good. Also, the thing with high hydration is that it's gonna make your dough so much more difficult to handle. Now, hydration is just the amount of water that's in your dough. And in baker's math, and I'm gonna tell you, I am not a math fan, even though my mom is a math teacher. So this is about as in-depth with math as I'm gonna ever get with you. But if you wanna figure out what the hydration percentage is of the sourdough recipe that you're using, all you're gonna do is take the amount of water that's in your recipe and divide it by the amount of flour and then multiply it by 100. So for example, if you have 500 grams of flour and 350 grams of water in your recipe, you'd be working with a 70% hydration dough, okay? Basic math, we got it. That's as deep as we're gonna get with the math. But all it really means is that a higher hydration recipe has more water and a lower hydration recipe has less water. The higher the hydration, the more difficult the dough is gonna be to work with. We're talking like really sticky and very, very challenging for a new baker. If you're a beginner sourdough baker, I encourage you to work with anywhere between 65 to 70% hydration in your recipes. Now, I'm gonna show you these two pieces of sourdough bread here. This one is a 65% hydration recipe. So you can see when we look at the interior of the bread, this is called the crumb. It has a very tight crumb. That just means there's not a lot of big, open, airy holes throughout this bread. It's got a tight crumb. Still gonna be a great bread to eat. It's not dry, it's gonna taste great. This here is a 73% hydration dough. So this bread was made with 73% water, and you can actually see a lot more of those holes. It's more of an open crumb. Still gonna be a great piece of bread, but it definitely has more of an open crumb than this one right over here. So again, a higher hydration recipe, it's not a competition. You don't need to make bread with giant holes in it and be frustrated because you can't figure out the process. So take it from me, stick with right around 70%. You're gonna be making beautiful bread that everybody's gonna love to eat. Here's something I wish I learned on day one, and honestly, if you only learn one thing from this video, let it be this, because it will make such a big difference on your sourdough bread. Aggressively mix your dough for 5 to 7 minutes as soon as you've added all your ingredients. If you're following my beginner method with my sourdough beginner's guide, which is linked below and has my beginner sourdough recipe, we do an autolyse first, which means we just combine the flour and the water. We mix our flour and water and we let it rest for 30 minutes. This allows the flour to become hydrated by the water, and it will make your dough easier to handle later on. Now, after we've done the autolyse and let our dough sit for 30 minutes, we're gonna add the sourdough starter and salt. And this is when I go in hard with the mix, all right? Now, I've already got my sourdough starter and my salt in here, and it looks like this is mixed up. This is not mixed up. I'm gonna get in here and I'll show you how I do that, and I'm really gonna mix this dough. So I'm gonna get in with my hands, and the reason why we do this is because we're developing the gluten. Now, it's okay to be aggressive at this point with your dough. We haven't built up any gas yet in our dough, so there's nothing to deflate. We're not going to hurt our dough. All we're doing right now is building up the gluten strength, developing the gluten in our dough. This is gonna give us a stronger dough later on, which is gonna mean a couple of things. It's gonna be easier to handle, and we're gonna have a taller loaf. We're making a stronger dough, which is gonna lead to a taller loaf of bread. Now, sourdough is a long process. That bulk fermentation process takes a long time, and then we put it in the refrigerator for the overnight cold ferment. That's a lot of time for the gluten to break down and for the bread to deflate. But if we develop a really strong gluten in the beginning with this aggressive mix, that won't happen. And what I find with most beginner bakers is that they do not develop the gluten enough, and a lot of times that's why the loaf fails. So you can see here, I'm taking my hand in kind of a cupping motion, and I'm slapping the dough against the side of the bowl in my hand. And this is a lot of work. So if you have a stand mixer, I sometimes do this in my KitchenAid on speed 2 for 5 minutes. But you don't need a mixer. You can do it by hand, just like I am right now, for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then I'm just gonna turn the bowl and keep going. I know that's super noisy, right? Okay, so I'm gonna keep doing this. We'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like after I've mixed it. You can see what the dough looks like after a little bit of aggressive mixing. So really, you will literally be able to watch the dough transform. And when the process is all said and done and you're baking your bread, your loaf is gonna be taller, which is what we all want. And yes, at first, you're probably gonna get dough all over your hands. That's totally normal and absolutely worth it. So mix your dough really aggressively in the beginning, and don't skip any of the stretch and folds. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe if this video is helpful. I've got so many sourdough walkthroughs, complete step-by-step videos, and lots of great sourdough recipes that you don't want to miss out on. Tip number 5, clocks lie, but the dough tells the truth. Timelines and recipes are only guidelines. The dough is the boss. Bulk fermentation isn't done just because the recipe said 4 hours or the clock hit a number. It's done when the dough says so. And here's what I've learned over 15 years and thousands of loaves. I always let my dough double in size during bulk fermentation. And I know there are people that say only let it rise 60 or 75%. But whenever I do that, my bread just doesn't turn out as good. In my opinion, the best loaves live on the edge of over fermentation every single time. So I always let my dough double in size. This red line is where my dough was when I put it into this container to start bulk fermentation. and here it is now. It's clearly doubled in size. Most new bakers are terrified of over fermenting their dough, but they really should be more worried about under fermenting their dough. Under fermented bread is dense, gummy, and just kind of yucky. You slice into it and you're like, ugh. Over fermented bread, it can bake up a little bit flatter, but it's still tasty and really, really good. So it's okay to over ferment. I would over ferment versus under fermenting any day of the week. So don't be afraid to push it. So here's what to look for to know that bulk fermentation is done with your dough. The dough has doubled in size. There's a slight domed, almost like a muffin top on your dough. So if we look in here at this container, you can kind of see that the dough is pulling away from the sides of the container and kind of bubbling up like a muffin top. And then you'll see that there are bubbles all along the sides of the container, so you can see that your dough is alive and that fermentation is happening. We can actually see some bubbles right here on the surface of the dough too, and it feels light and airy. And I kind of describe that to people as like a giant fluffy marshmallow. That's the feel that you're going for. And when you shake the container, the whole mass of dough should move. So there you go. The whole mass of dough is moving. Now I'm gonna reach in here and I'm gonna pull some of this dough away from the sides of the container so you can see what that looks like as well. So there you go. Do you see how it's coming away from the sides of the container? This dough is done bulk fermenting and it's ready to be pre-shaped. And here's the thing, I'm sticking my hands in here and it's not really sticky at all. Your dough should not be super sticky. Now sourdough is always gonna be a little bit sticky, but my hands aren't wet and I'm sticking my hand in here and they're coming out pretty clean. Those are all the signs that bulk fermentation is done. So don't be afraid to push your dough and let it go a little bit longer on the bulk fermentation. And also, if you can get a clear container with straight sides, it's gonna make it a lot easier for you to see exactly how much your dough has risen. Goodbye, Dutch oven, and hello, loaf pan. You can absolutely bake great sourdough bread without a Dutch oven. A simple loaf pan is beginner friendly, gives you a consistent shape, slices like a dream, and is perfect for sandwiches or the toaster. Now here's why I like baking sourdough bread in a loaf pan for beginner bakers. The tall sides of the loaf pan will actually force the bread to rise up. So if you've made a few loaves of sourdough and they've fallen flat when baking in your Dutch oven, try baking in a loaf pan. Now you still need to be able to properly bulk ferment your dough, but while you're learning, baking in a loaf pan is a great way to have some success. Also, you don't have to buy an expensive Dutch oven if you don't already have one, because you probably have a loaf pan. Now, you're gonna need 2 loaf pans, because the way that you'll bake in a loaf pan is that you'll put your dough, pretend this is dough and not fully baked bread, you'll put your dough in your loaf pan, you'll use another loaf pan as the cover. And basically what we're doing is just copying the cover that we have on our Dutch oven. So you're gonna put another lid over your loaf pan. I just use another loaf pan, put it right on the top and bake for about 25 minutes, then take the lid off and continue baking for another 20 or 25 minutes. Now, I love baking in a loaf pan. The bread turns out great, and like I said before, it's the perfect size for the toaster and for sandwiches. So if you need a win and you're making sourdough bread and you're a beginner, give baking in a loaf pan a try. It's one of my favorite ways to bake sourdough. Next up, always bake the bread. Think you ruined the dough? Bake it anyways. Maybe it overproofed, maybe it's under fermented, maybe shaping went sideways. Who cares? Just get it in the oven. Now, why am I so passionate about this? Because you'll learn from all of your mistakes. Let's say that you think you under fermented your dough, but you decide to bake it anyways, or you over fermented it. When you bake that bread and you slice it up and you look inside at the crumb, you're gonna learn that, okay, when my dough feels like this, my bread turns out like this. Now, I cannot tell you how many new sourdough bakers have actually taken this advice and baked the bread that they thought, this dough is over fermented, there's no way, and they've baked the best loaves of their life. Now, one time I actually fell asleep while my dough was still bulk fermenting. I was gonna shape it and put it in my banneton and then go to bed, and I fell asleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I decided to just go ahead and bake the bread anyways, and it turned out absolutely beautiful. And it's gonna almost always taste good. Your family probably doesn't care what it looks like as long as it tastes good, and honestly, put enough butter on it and it's gonna taste good no matter what. So remove the fear. The fastest way to get confident is to finish the bake and look at the results. So when in doubt, bake it. In the worst case, we'll call it rustic, dip it in soup, slather it in butter, and still eat it. And the last piece of advice I have for you is to pick one method and one mentor and stick with it. Now, there are a lot of people explaining how to make sourdough bread, and everyone has a different way of doing it. It's no wonder it's so confusing. But if you're picking and choosing and taking one piece of advice from 10 different people, you're gonna get confused and you're probably not gonna be making the very best bread. So we all have a different way of teaching it. We all have a different method. That doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong or one's better than the other. But the only way you're going to know if that method works for you is if you pick a method, stick with it, and learn how to do it. And I recommend that you follow one method and try to make at least 5 loaves before you decide if it's working or not. Okay, so if you've made 5 loaves of bread following one person's method and they're still not turning out for you, it might be time to find somebody else to listen to you. In this day and age, everybody thinks that they're an expert. But I encourage you to find somebody who knows how to make good sourdough bread and consistently makes good bread. Not somebody who made one good loaf and then decided they're an expert, but somebody who's making hundreds and hundreds of loaves of bread. They always turn out good and you can count on them. That is the person whose advice you want to take so you don't end up confused and giving up on sourdough, because I promise it's worth it to stick with it. After baking thousands of loaves of sourdough bread, these are the 8 habits that really changed my sourdough. And I learned all of this the hard way. So take my advice and skip the struggle. And if you want to level up your sourdough skills fast and bake the best sourdough bread of your life, watch this video next, Perfect Sourdough Beginner's Guide, where I walk you through the entire process from step to step. It'll have you baking beautiful sourdough bread before you know it, and I'll see you over there.